on autographing books. We have books on the cart if you haven't already picked one up. You can have it autographed in paper on your way out. And we ask that you please form a single orderly line coming from the table going in that direction that way. Okay, now without further ado, please give a very warm welcome back to Paul Levy.
Wow. Yeah, I want to thank everyone for coming. What I'm doing here tonight with all of you is something that's really something that's very intense for me. It has like a lot of meaning in the sense that I've been through something, an ordeal that almost killed me and actually drove me crazy. It didn't almost drove me crazy. It completely drove me crazy. And for the first decade, I could only describe what was happening in a couple of sentences. Because when you experience, I don't even know what word to choose, but there was a level of trauma or abuse. When you experience that intensity of abuse, and when I say abuse, I'm not talking physical abuse, I'm talking in the psyche. When you experience real deep kind of emotional, psychological abuse, it actually cuts your vocal cords. Your ability to find words to transmit what you're experiencing becomes, it's like it's not operative. And so because of that, it's been since the early 80s, I've been having a dream. And the dream is about standing here and actually talking about what's in this book that I just wrote. And the thing is, so it's my story. It's the story of my life. But in a way, because it's an archetypal story, it actually, in a certain way, it interfaces with all of us and with everyone here, not just here, but our entire species. And not just on the individual dimension, but also collectively. That when you go through your personal process so deeply, you access, in a sense, the transpersonal or archetypal part of your experience, in which you discover, well, I'm actually not separate from the whole world and from everyone, and that what I've been experiencing is in a certain way what all of us are going through, and what our planet is going through, and what we're acting out on the world stage. And having that insight was the very thing that really helped me to make sense of what I was experiencing. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to tell the whole story because that's in the book. But I do want to share a little bit about, how I came to what the book is about and the deeper context for how the book came out. So I'm an only child, and it wound up that my father, he was this sick person, but he had a certain type of sickness that wasn't, according to traditional psychiatry or medicine, they weren't able to actually have the recognition of the depth of the depravity that he had fallen into. So he was really bright, he was charismatic, he presented a persona of being this really good person, this loving guy. And being the only child, he had a real identification with me. So growing up, I was just a happy, healthy kid. And as soon as I began to individuate, to separate from him, so when I was in, maybe 19, 20, 21 years old, that's when the problem started. And interestingly, according to the negative father mythology, it's when the son begins to individuate that constellates the archetype of the negative father. And that's exactly what happened for me. So the thing I'm saying is that it was what I was enacting in a personal dimension of my life was actually this mythic process of the negative father, which happens to be the deeper archetypal process, or at least one of the major ones that's playing out in our world. And okay, so without going into the specifics, the abuse, the emotional abuse, was so intense as I began to separate. And it was all because the part of me that was realizing I'm an artist and I wanted to be an artist and express myself creatively. That was the real essence of the process. And so the intensity of the abuse got so bad that after the worst night of it, I woke up and I had a fever. And I had that fever I had for 12 months. And I went to doctors, I went to hospitals, and they couldn't find anything that was wrong with me physically. And then after that 12 months, I began to feel a little bit better. And so as soon as I could, I moved as far away as I could from my parents. I was in my early 20s. And as if the trauma from the abuse was sort of in this gestation period in my psyche, as soon as I had moved away to the West Coast from the East Coast, that's when the symptoms of the trauma began to manifest. And it began to manifest so intensely from the abuse that I literally could barely function. So here I went from like a super highly functioning person to somebody who, you know, on a moment-by-moment basis could barely even live his life. And so that got my attention. I mean, it really grabs your attention when all of a sudden something like that happens. And it was really obvious the symptoms were completely having to do with what played out with my father. And, you know, keep in mind, in the book I talk about this in way more specifics. So what I did, the only thing I figured out that could help my suffering was to step back and to assume the position of being the observer and just playing the witness of what was happening in my mind. And as I did that, I began to subtly and slowly start to feel a little bit better, though I was in incredible over-the-top suffering. And I was going to therapy, and I was, you know, I'm an artist, so I was drawing and painting. And then after doing that, doing the introspection, the meditation for maybe, I don't know, a little bit, maybe a couple of years, a little bit under 2 years, and I'm not going to go into the whole story because whatever, I got hit by a bolt of lightning, not from the sky, but inside my brain, went into a complete altered state in which I was realizing, oh my God, this is a mass shared dream that all of us are dreaming up together into materialization. And it was such an ecstatic experience that within 24 hours, I wound up getting thrown into a mental hospital because from the outside, it appeared as if I was having a psychotic break. And I'm not going to go into, you know, that's a whole other story. But what I can say is during that next, I don't know, 18 months, probably I seemed to have a propensity to get myself thrown in mental hospitals during that time. So maybe 3, 4, or 5. At a certain point, I lost count. Other times I got thrown in mental hospitals, and I always got diagnosed as having chemical imbalance. And my parents, who in their cosmology, you know, if somebody's a doctor, they're an authority figure, they just fully subscribe to that. And I guess I wanted to just add a footnote. So it's come out, if people aren't aware, that there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance. That was made up by the pharmaceutical companies to sell drugs, to make money. And now in the last 10 years, they've actually confessed that. And if you don't know that, because it's this meme that I still hear people saying, oh, so-and-so has a chemical imbalance. Well, there's no such thing. And that's been like shown by psychiatry. But yet every single psychiatrist was giving me a diagnosis of being bipolar, chemically imbalanced, guaranteeing that I would have to be on medication for the rest of my life or I would have another psychotic break. Now, I should just sort of comment that I haven't been on any medication since, I don't know, the early 80s, maybe 83, 84 at the latest, without any, well, maybe I am having a psychotic break, I don't know, but without any, whatever, without any episodes. And, but how come I tell the story about psychiatry is that, see, it's so fed into the process with my father, because as soon as I got that diagnosis, then I became the identified patient. I became the one in the family system who was supposedly sick. And in the meanwhile, I was tracking, there was something going on with my father that was really dark. There was an intense shadow coming through him. But as soon as I got that diagnosis, you see, in psychiatry, when you get a diagnosis, then they see you through the lens of that diagnosis. So anything I would say, they would interpret as, oh, well, that's being said by somebody who's bipolar. I mean, it's insane. So not only did they give me this misdiagnosis, and not only did they not have the recognition, oh, he's actually, something healthy is happening, there's some sort of spiritual awakening, because spiritual awakenings almost always get precipitated by deep wounding or trauma or abuse. And I qualified. I was in deep, deep trauma. So in one sense, I'm actually coming out of the closet tonight by saying, yeah, I've been in incredible over-the-top trauma since, the early 80s. But the whole way I've been dealing with it and holding it, it's actually helped me to discover something deep within me that I wouldn't have discovered if it weren't for the abuse. And it's helped me find my work, which hopefully is helping some people. But so not only did they give me the misdiagnosis, not recognize the healthy spiritually awakening part, but then I kept on trying to metacommunicate. Once they gave me the medication, it brought me down from the spiritual awakening. And then I began talking about the abuse from my father, and psychiatry just interpreted that as, oh, well, that's his illness. And my mother, who we had an incredibly close, as loving a relationship as you can have with a mother, she protected my father, tragically. And so basically, my father's illness, which I'll get to because it's actually not just his illness, it's my illness, it's all of our illness. It's what I wrote a book about before this one. My father's illness actually not only created enormous suffering for me, but my relationship with my mother was completely destroyed. By the time she died, she shared with me on her deathbed that this whole idea that I'm like a teacher and a writer and a healer and blah, 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 that's my hallucination. And I want to say, Mom, that's right. But that wouldn't have gone over well. But my father's illness also consumed my whole family. I have no family left. So my parents both have died. All of the extended family, I've been excommunicated. And it was interesting for me because I was in the role of pointing out the evil that was coming through my father, which I didn't really know what it was, but I was experiencing it in a direct way. But I couldn't understand, like, where's it coming from? And it was really interesting to me because the whole time I was taking notes and drawing maps and trying to understand what the hell is going on here. And what I was experiencing was, wow, being in the role of the one who was pointing out the evil that was playing out in the family system, then all of a sudden, the way the family system reacted to that was by seeing me as the bad guy and by seeing me as crazy. You see, so what I'm beginning to point at, and it's this that's the major theme in this new book, is that I was beginning to like actually see that there's a deeper, almost you could say a higher dimensional process that was informing what was playing out in the family system so as to protect the abuser. That was really interesting to me. It was like every single time where light was being shined on the abuse, something in an amazingly synchronistic way, it was like the whole environment would configure to protect my father. And at a certain point, it got my attention so much that I began to have the realization, wow, there's something that is actually being revealed to me through the whole ordeal. And so that's a whole other theme of the book, that we're all going through whatever particular form of an initiatory ordeal we're going through, whether it's personal or collectively as a species or with our relationship or whatever. And what I'm pointing at is that encoded in that ordeal that it actually has some form of a gift, if you're able to hold it right. So the psychiatry thing fed into the father thing. They were almost like two interconnected, entangled quantum entities that became indistinguishable. And I began to see, the same deeper evil, if you may, that was informing my father was informing psychiatry. Now, when you use the word, when you say something's evil, that's a charged word. And I just want to say I picked that word on purpose. And I discussed this in the book, that there's no better word for what I'm pointing at, because what I'm pointing at is not just personal evil, like the shadow of my father or my shadow, but what I'm pointing at in the book is archetypal evil. And we as a species are, if we don't come to terms with what that's about, we then will continue to enact that energy, self or other, destructively on the planet like we're doing, and we're going to destroy the biosphere, the life support system of our planet, blah, blah, blah. And to take a step back, I just want to more fill in the story. So there's psychiatry in my father, and then there's my mother, who is complicit with protecting my father. And then there was me, who, because in the book I go, look, I'm not just like this. Yeah, I was completely innocent of what was playing out, and I was complicit by my own unconscious reactions. Because that's the thing about what I'm pointing at, is that when you really get to the deeper dimension that's playing out, you discover that we all are interconnected, and you can't separate yourself out. If you're seeing evil out there, that's a reflection of something inside of you. So I openly, in the book, share my own, the part of me that is mad, like all of us have a part of us that's mad. And so I just want to make that clear. So I'm not just like, blaming my father or playing the victim. I'm saying, no, we're all in this together. So, but how come I chose that word? When I say, what is the subtitle? When evil becomes your father. I had an incredible dream. And in the book, there's a ton of dreams. But in this one dream, I found one of the collected works of Jung that look just like this. They're black with white letters, and I have all of them. I collect them. I read them. I've read them a million times, basically. And in this dream, the one I have, I've never seen before. And the title of the collected work, it actually says "The Problem of the Father." So I'm really curious. I'm going, wow, here's a collected work that I didn't know about. So I open it up to a page, and the page says one word on it. Try to guess what word. E-V-I-L. It says evil. I touch the page. It comes out in my hand. I'm holding this page, which says evil, from the collected work of the problem of the father, and then I wake up and I'm left holding the page. That's one dream of many, many dreams over the course of time where my unconscious was trying to teach me something. You see, when I got out of that last hospital in '82, I was in deep trouble because not only had I been totally experiencing the trauma from my father, but then on top of that was the trauma from psychiatry. Then, all of a sudden, night after night, I began having these dreams, these unbelievable dreams, these dreams that you only have like once in a life. I was having them night after night after night for years. And they were actually showing me. And that, what I'm describing isn't anything like, oh, I'm so special. That's the way the unconscious works. It compensates a one-sidedness. When you're in trouble, the unconscious comes to your aid, and it was really trying to show me what was happening. So, yeah, but my father was a bad guy. After he died in 2002, I had a series of dreams. I'll share one because it's really the essence. And in this dream, I'm like rehearsing. And I'm saying over and over in the dream to an imaginary father, you're a bad man. You're a bad man. Almost like a little kid. That just cuts right through any of the intellectual stuff. And then into the dream walks my father. And I try to say to him the words I've been rehearsing, and I can't get the words out. You know how like people's energies interact and takes away your voice? So that it's kind of what I mean when I say that when there's abuse, it severs your ability to find language. So to fill in this story, so I was deeply suffering, and then at a certain point, so my father had a sister, my aunt, and I was talking to her on the phone one day. And I happened to be complaining that my mother was protecting my father. And what she said was most interesting. She says, Paul, she's not just protecting your father, she's protecting herself. Because if she weren't doing that, she would have to show to the world what a complete idiot she had married. And keep in mind that this is my father's sister, his only sibling. So then it was like she got going, and like a plug had become unplugged. And she says to me, she goes, Paul, do you know Hannibal Lecter? Do you know who Hannibal Lecter is? And I'm assuming everybody is aware of Hannibal Lecter. He's like in cinema, almost like the embodiment of evil in a human being, and he's a cannibal. And so I say to my aunt, well, of course, Aunt Helen, I'm familiar with Hannibal Lecter. And then, and I'll never forget this, she says, that's the sort of person your father is. And when she said that, I felt such a relief, And I'm serious because I had been experiencing that mindfuck, that psychological torture at his hands. And all of a sudden, it was like by breaking the unspoken code of silence in the family, she was spilling the beans. And then she said to me something even more interesting. She says, your father did something before you were born that was so horrible and so terrible. And our parents died, brokenhearted because of it. So when I was born, my grandparents were already passed away. She goes, but I will never, ever tell you what it was because it was so horrible and so terrible. So that was really interesting to me. You can imagine. I'm like, whoa, there's a family secret. What's up with that? Now, one of the things I've learned, because I'm sort of like this nerd, so I study stuff, is that when there's a family secret, it insinuates itself subterraneously into the unconscious of the family. Not just in the particular momentary family, but over, sometimes multiple these different generations. And it wreaks its havoc. Because when there's a secret, the person carrying the secret, they're on some energetic dimension separate from the rest of the family because they have a secret and they're not telling. And it was interesting, the two people at least who had the secret in my family were my father and his sister. They weren't telling. And I think with my mother, I think she knew nothing about the secret. So that really helped me. And So then my father died in 2002, and I figured, okay, I'm going to give my aunt, his sister, just a little while. And keep in mind, she hated my father. I'll give her, a little while, maybe 1 month, 2 months, because she was grieving. I couldn't believe how intensely she was grieving, and yet she hated my father. That also was really interesting to me. But then, within like 2 weeks of my father dying, she dropped dead, and she took the secret with her to her grave. But I want to say now I had a dream, and I'm not going to share the dream here. I share the dream in the book, and it was like one of those dreams where you just know the truth of it. And when I had this dream, I absolutely, positively, in every cell of my body knew, oh, this is what happened. And no. See, now you gotta buy the book, and So, but the thing which was really interesting, I mean, there was a lot that was interesting to me, but it was as if there was a non-local field that was protecting, that whenever I or anybody was bringing in light, trying to shed light on what actually was happening, more and more it was like there was almost like choreographed from a higher dimension. There was like a non-local field, like I was saying, that was protecting the abuser. It was almost like the impulse to bring light in then, in a way, constellated some sort of darker force. And then I began to have the realization, oh, they're not separate. That's not like an error, but there's some sort of like this higher dimensional process that was actually showing itself. And so that's, in a sense, what I'm really talking about in the book. And one other way of saying that is that I began to recognize, so, when I had that spiritual awakening and I got myself thrown in the first mental hospital, I was beginning to recognize, wow, this is a dream. This isn't sort of metaphorically, like, sort of, kind of like metaphorically like a dream, but it's actually a dream. And I don't even know how else to say that. That was really astounding to me, because all that time up until that moment, I was of the opinion that this was something that was not a dream. Anyways, what I mean to say is, when you have the recognition that waking life is like a dream, one way of understanding that is that your inner process is actually playing out through the outer world, that it's actually reflecting itself through the outer world. Because if you think about what is a dream is a reflection, a projection of the mind. So whatever your inner process is in a dream, it actually is manifesting as the dreamscape, because the dreamscape is nothing other than your inner process just materializing as the dream. What I was beginning to discover is that that's the nature of the waking dream. And so what began happening with my father and with psychiatry, I began to realize, oh my God, somehow what's playing out is actually expressing something deep inside of me. And I'll give you an actual example, an actual experience that happened that really began to show me this. And it was so over the top amazing that it took me maybe, I don't know, 12 years, 10 years before I really began to realize, oh my God, I think that was a synchronicity. I mean, it was that big of a synchronicity that I didn't even know it at the time. And what happened? So I got out of the last hospital in '82. And that was the darkest night of the dark night of my soul, in the sense that here, the courts had mandated that I be on medication, that I see a psychiatrist, so I was on medication. At first, it was antipsychotics, only for a couple of weeks, thank God, and they were the worst in the sense that any creativity I have, they just shut down, so I refer to them as is an anti-creative, not an antipsychotic. But and then like whatever, there's a cocktail of medications that I quickly got myself off as soon as I could. But the point was, for that first year out of the hospital, I couldn't work. I was on this disability, and I knew I didn't want to accept that because I knew that was programming my subconscious. So very soon I got off the disability as soon as I was able to work. But it took maybe that first maybe 12 months before I felt okay. And I was living back with my parents, which was a nightmare, in a small little suffocating apartment. And at the end of that year, okay, I feel finally that I can actually take my first step towards separating from my family now after being diagnosed and medicated. And I go for my first job interview. And I will never forget this. And I swear I'm not making this up. So I go to the job interview, and I borrowed my mother's car, and I come back to the apartment, and both of my parents are at work. I'm home for about, 10 minutes, and all of a sudden there's a knock on the door. That's curious. It's in the afternoon. It's early afternoon. So I go to the door and I ask who it is, and I hear a very serious voice on the other side of the door saying, "It's the police." And I'm like, okay, could you prove to me that you're the police? And they show me a very official police badge through the peephole. So I open up the door, and into the apartment they rush, 12 policemen, and not with guns, but with these rifles pointing at my head. And I'm thinking wow, what? I don't even know what I was thinking, but and I noticed they have this little town on their, that they're the police people of, on their, police whatever on their sleeve, and I drove through that town on the way back from the job interview, and I'm literally thinking, oh my God, did I run somebody over and not remember, not know it, or just not realize it or something? And then they're rushing around the apartment, and they're running from, it's a small little apartment, and then by them talking to each other, I realize what's happening. They think that I robbed a bank. And when I realized that, I felt such a relief, because I knew I would have remembered if I had robbed a bank. And what had happened, on the way back from the job interview, I stopped off at my favorite Chinese restaurant to get my favorite wonton soup. And it was a little bit before noon, and they were closed. And I drove off, and right at that moment, the bank next door to the Chinese restaurant in the strip mall was being robbed. And somebody saw my car driving off right at that moment, and they gave my license plate to the police. So, but they take me away. They take me to the police station. So I'm in this garden apartment. There are 4 apartments in the hallway. They lead me down the stairs, and all the neighbors they know me because I grew up at that garden apartment, And I'm just saying to them, I was just getting wonton soup. I was just getting wonton soup. Then they take me out to the street, and the whole block is surrounded by police cars, and all the neighbors are saying, the Levy boy being led away by the police. And so in that car with the policeman, and there were police cars in front and back, and I'm saying to him, hey, look, I didn't do it, I swear, I didn't do anything. And he said to me, and this is amazing, he says, look, one day you'll have a great story. And boy, was he right, So they bring me to the police station, and they keep me there for the afternoon, and they give me these lie detector tests. Now, I'm not sure if anybody has ever had lie detector tests. They're a total trip, because they hook you up, and then they say, okay, is your name Paul, whatever, are you such and such years old? And then they say, did you rob the bank? And as soon as you hear the question, adrenaline just pulses through all of your veins. And they kept on, like, saying it in different ways. And every time, like, I felt like, oh my God, I'm probably going to totally fail because just hearing the question got me so freaked out. One of the most memorable parts of that experience was when I had to call my mother, who was at work, whose car I had. And I'm like, Mom, hi, I'm not going to be able to pick you up at work. I'm at the police station. They think I robbed a bank. And her response was, she was just listening. I was telling her the story. And her response was like, give me that policeman. Like she was just, and then I was like, she wants to talk with you. So they actually let me out. They let me out after, however many, 3-4 hours, because they understood they had just gotten some schmo who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I actually went back to the police station like the next week because I was so curious if they ever found the guy, and they never found the robbers. But how come I tell this story? Just to contemplate it as if I had a dream that was bad, right? What had I been doing? For the first time in that time that I was living at my parents, for that, it was over a year, a little bit over a year, I finally took a step towards, I'm going to separate, I'm going to individuate. Now, the essence of my abuse from my father was that whenever I expressed any separation, when I expressed being a separate individual, it was seen as the worst crime imaginable. That's what he would transmit in a number of ways, whether it's these murderous rages or having heart attacks or having strokes or telling me I'm killing him or whatever. But it was always the real essence was for me to express my individuated self, which was by definition separate from my father. It was to commit the worst crime. So just hold that thought for him for a moment and then think about what just happened. So I take my first step towards separating from my family system, from my father, and within like minutes, I have like rifles pointed at my head like I've committed like this horrible crime. Is that just an accident or a coincidence? Well, it took me a number of years before I actually, fully took in that, I think that was a synchronicity, because synchronicities are an expression of this being a dream. Because think about what a synchronicity is. It's our inner process that's manifesting as the outer world. And so that's an example of what I mean when I'm trying to say that something was happening in me through the abuse that was actually helping me to wake up. And that's why I titled the book the way I did. Now, what I just described was my own personal experience, but in essence, when I was saying it's archetypal, what I mean is that in essence, I would bet money that every single one of us, that our deep down experience of not being fully, whatever, whether you call it enlightened, whatever that is, or we're just being healed, that, whether we have a wound or a trauma or abuse, that in essence it comes down to that we've gotten whatever, for whatever way we did, some sort of like message from the universe that for us to actually express ourselves and be in our light and be who we are and speak our voice, that it's not okay, that it's wrong, that it's not safe. In essence, that's what, I'm talking about my own experience, but when I say it's archetypal, that's what I'm meaning, that's really how it interfaces with, that's actually the experience of everyone in one form or another, And so my biggest fear, well, I have a number of them, but one of them, when I was young, was getting up in front of a crowd in public speaking. But the second one was to go through something like this and not find the words, not be able to communicate it. Because in my family, at any point that I was trying to, and every point that I was trying to express what was happening, what my experience was. The reflection I got from my family whenever I would express what I was experiencing was, that's not what you're experiencing. And every single response I got was protecting my father. Whether people were saying, oh, you just need to get over it, or you're making a big deal, or it's all your interpretation, or it's all your imagination, or stop blaming your father, or take responsibility. They're all covert ways of protecting the abuser. Sorry. That's okay, thank you. So it's like this, kind of like having this actual dream that's coming true, to have come out with this book. And in this book, I honestly want to say, I mean, I feel like because I study all this stuff because I had to learn this stuff or else I wouldn't have made it. And I'm not just saying that. I mean, so to actually be able to find the words to get across and to finally be able to connect with my voice and to be able to articulate the way psychological abuse, because psychological abuse is really, really hard to communicate because there's no bruises, there's no black and blue, and it's in the realm of psyche, which is like a vapor. And so every single time that I try to express in my family about the abuse, I always, at a certain point, was sorry I ever brought anything up because I just never felt seen. There was never, ever a witness. That conversation I had with my Aunt Helen when she was telling me about Hannibal Lecter and your father did this horrible, terrible thing, how that conversation ended, it ended by her saying, Paul, your problem is that you refuse to take lithium. That's your problem. So it was like, here she's saying all these horrible things about my father. And she was saying to me, you should leave your father, get as far away from him as possible, ASAP. I'm not making this up, And yet, by the end of that conversation, she tells me that my problem was that I refused to take pharmaceutical drugs because it was more comfortable for her to snap back into the family trance and to have me be the identified patient compared to really holding that place of truth in her that saw that my father was enacting evil. Now, when I say my father was enacting evil, I just want to clarify something before we close, because I just got an email from somebody who had read the book, and she's like, oh, you say your father's this evil man, and I can't, subscribe to that or whatever. He's a human being. But she was also saying, oh, I didn't really read a lot of the book. Because the thing with the book, it's going to trigger just about everybody, because when you deal with this level of abuse and trauma and darkness, just take my word for it, you'll be triggered. You'll get your money's worth. But what I want to explain to her and to everyone is that my father was just an instrument. He had so, in a sense, let go and was a conduit or a vehicle for archetypal evil. He was like a portal through which archetypal evil came through, and then it actually triggered other people's, like the psychiatrists, my mother, the relatives, my friends, everybody in this system configured to protect him because he had become, like I'm saying, an open instrument for the archetype of the shadow of evil to come through. To say, oh, he was evil, no, he was a human being. That's to conflate the personal and the archetypal, and I make that point really clear, but that woman who wrote me the email, she skipped that part. So basically, that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. To end, let me say, when I was saying that when I got out of that hospital, my unconscious came to my aid. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. The first one, I'm in a dream, and I'm having the suspicion that it's actually a dream. And I go up to one of my dream characters and I ask him, hey, is this a dream? And he says, uh-uh. And I took his word for it. And then I woke up after that and I was so pissed. But that taught me something. So then a little while later, I had another dream, and in this dream, I actually had the realization that I was dreaming. I didn't have to ask somebody else. I didn't have to project out my authority, and I had lucidity. And spontaneously, I began chanting a mantra. It was so many years ago, I wasn't even doing this practice. It was the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, the mantra of compassion. So in other words, what I was saying, as soon as I had lucidity, it was like this reflex of just chanting Om Mani Padme Hum. And interestingly, in Buddhism, they'll talk about that when you have awakening, it's always the co-joining of emptiness, which is to have lucidity, and compassion. And Om Mani Padme Hum is the mantra of compassion. So basically, every time that I have the awareness in a dream that I'm in a dream, that I'm dreaming, you know, there are all these different dimensions, but when I really fully get that, I just, without even thinking about it, start chanting Om Mani Padme Hum. And what I want to share is one of the all-time greatest dreams of my life to end this little talk. And in the dream, I'm with my father. And I say to him, I go, Dad, I'm dreaming. And of course, he immediately thinks I'm crazy, which, you know, that's typical of our dynamic. But then I realize I really am dreaming. And I start to float up in the air. And I start to say, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum. I just, you know, not even that I'm consciously choosing to do that. It's coming through me. The mantra is chanting itself through me. And then I'm going to start crying. The mantra changes to, Dad, I love you. And I just start chanting, Dad, I love you. Dad, I love you. Dad, I love you. And I'm filled with the most incredible ecstasy, like every cell in my body was having orgasms. It was incredible bliss. It went on for a while, and then I woke up. And I guess the one commentary I want to say is that's, you know, obviously one of my major practices that I do every day. And it has to do with the power of compassion to really heal anything. So thank you very much. And I think I'll be signing some books.